My brother has been sending me money for my cancer treatment, but I've never been diagnosed with anything. I opened my banking app to check if my paycheck had deposited when I noticed a transfer I didn't recognize. $2,500 from my brother Kevin with a memo that read, Month 6 treatment support. I stared at the screen in my kitchen, my coffee getting cold. Month 6 of what? I scrolled back through my transaction history and found 5 identical transfers, all from Kevin, all with similar memos. Treatment fund. Medical bills help. Chemo cycle 4 support. The amounts varied between $1,800 and $3,000, totaling nearly $14,000 over 6 months. I hadn't talked to Kevin in almost a year, not since our argument at Thanksgiving about him borrowing money from our parents again. I called him immediately, but the phone went straight to voicemail. I tried 3 more times with the same result. Then I called our mother. She answered on the second ring, her voice tight with emotion. Liam, sweetheart, how are you feeling today? Did the new medication help with the nausea? I stood frozen in my kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear. I said, Mom, what are you talking about? What medication? There was a long pause. Her voice cracked when she spoke. The anti-nausea medication Dr. Reeves prescribed after your last chemo session. Kevin said you were having a really hard time with the side effects. My chest went cold. I said, Mom, I haven't been to any doctor. I haven't had any chemo. I don't have cancer. She made a sound like I'd slapped her. Liam, this isn't funny. Kevin's been keeping us updated every week. You were diagnosed with stage 3 lymphoma 6 months ago. You've been doing chemotherapy at Sterling Medical Center. I sat down hard at my kitchen table. I said, I work full-time at Grayson Engineering. I feel perfectly fine. I haven't been sick. I haven't seen any doctors. Whatever Kevin told you isn't true. My mother's breathing became rapid. She said, He's been sending us photos of you in the hospital. He said you didn't want us to visit because you looked so bad and didn't want us to see you that way. He said you were embarrassed about losing your hair. I touched my full head of hair instinctively. I asked, What photos? Mom, I need to see everything Kevin's told you. She was crying now. He set up a GoFundMe page. The whole church community has been donating. Your father and I have been sending money every month for your medical bills. We've sent over $30,000. The number hit me in the gut. I said, I need you and Dad to come to my apartment right now. Bring everything Kevin's given you. My parents arrived within an hour. My father looked like he'd aged a decade, his face gray and drawn. My mother clutched a folder to her chest. We sat in my living room and she opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were printed emails from Kevin, detailed updates about my supposed treatment progress, side effects, doctor, consultations, and prognosis. Each email was clinical and specific, mentioning drug names, blood count numbers, and treatment protocols. She also had printouts of photos that made my blood run cold. They showed a man in a hospital bed, thin and pale with a bald head, connected to an IV. The man's face was turned away from the camera in most shots, or obscured by medical equipment. In the clearest photo, the man looked somewhat like me but wasn't me. My father's voice was hollow. Kevin said you specifically asked him not to let us visit. He said you wanted to get through the worst of it before seeing us. I pulled out my laptop and showed them my work calendar, fully booked with engineering meetings and project deadlines for the past 6 months. I showed them my recent photos from a company retreat 2 weeks ago, showing me healthy and active with my full team. I pulled up my medical insurance portal showing 0 claims, 0 doctor visits, 0 prescriptions. My mother stared at the D screen, then at the photos from Kevin, then back at me. She whispered, I don't understand. Why would Kevin do this? My father stood abruptly and pulled out his phone. He called Kevin and put it on speaker. It rang 5 times before Kevin answered, his voice casual. Hey, Dad. What's up? My father's voice shook with rage. Your brother is sitting right here in front of me, perfectly healthy. He doesn't have cancer. He's never had cancer. What the hell have you been doing? There was complete silence on the line. Then Kevin hung up. I grabbed my father's phone and called Kevin back, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried 4 more times. Nothing. I said, Show me this GoFundMe page. My mother pulled it up on her phone. The page was titled, Help Liam Fight Lymphoma, with a goal of $50,000. It had raised $47,000 from 230 donors over 6 months. The main photo was one of the fake hospital images, the bald man with his face turned away. The description was detailed and heartbreaking, written in first person as if I'd written it myself. It described my diagnosis, my fear, my determination to fight, and my gratitude for any support. It mentioned my job, my hobbies, personal details about my life that only family would know. The updates section had regular posts tracking my supposed treatment journey, describing side effects, small victories, and setbacks. Each post had dozens of comments from friends, extended family, and church members offering prayers and encouragement. I felt violated in a way I couldn't articulate. Kevin had created an entire false narrative of my life, complete with a terminal illness, and used it to collect money from everyone who cared about me. I scrolled through the donor list and recognized names. My aunt and uncle had donated $2,000. Family friends from childhood had donated hundreds each. My father's co-workers had donated. The church community had apparently organized multiple fundraisers, all of it based on a lie. My father was reading over my shoulder, his hands clenched into fists. He said, "I'm calling the police right now." I nodded, unable to speak. My mother had collapsed onto my couch, her body shaking with sobs. She kept saying, "We thought you were dying. We thought we were losing you." The pain in her voice was worse than anger. Kevin hadn't just stolen money. He'd put our parents through 6 months of believing their son had cancer. Officer Nicole Barrett arrived 30 minutes later with her partner, Officer James Keller. Barrett was in her mid-40s with sharp, assessing eyes. She listened to our explanation, took notes, and examined the GoFundMe page on my mother's phone. She said, "This is wire fraud and identity theft at minimum, possibly extortion depending on how he solicited donations. The amounts involved make it a felony." She asked to see the bank transfers, the emails, and the photos. My father pulled up his bank records showing monthly transfers to Kevin totaling $30,000 over 6 months. My mother showed the printed emails with their detailed medical updates. Officer Keller photographed everything while Barrett called for a detective. She told us, "This is sophisticated fraud. He created medical documentation, impersonated you in writing, and maintained the deception over an extended period. We need to move quickly before he destroys evidence or flees." Detective Ray Ashford arrived 20 minutes later, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, wearing a rumpled suit. He reviewed everything we'd shown the officers, his expression growing darker. He said, "The GoFundMe platform will cooperate with our investigation and freeze the account immediately. Mr. Reeves, I need you to file a formal identity theft report. Mr. and Mrs. Reeves, you'll need to provide statements detailing every interaction with Kevin regarding your son's supposed illness." He pulled out his phone and made a call. "I'm getting a warrant for Kevin Reeves's phone records, bank accounts, and residence. We need to know where the money went and whether there are other victims." My father asked, "Other victims?" Ashford nodded grimly. "Fraud schemes this elaborate are rarely one-time events. If he did this to family, he may have done it to others." We spent 3 hours at the police station giving statements. I described every detail of my actual life over the past 6 months, my work schedule, my health, my complete lack of medical treatment. My parents described every conversation with Kevin, every update about my supposed condition, every dollar they'd sent. My mother broke down twice while recounting how Kevin had described my fear during diagnosis, my bravery during treatment, my gratitude for their support. All words Kevin had invented and attributed to me. Detective Ashford recorded everything, his questions precise and probing. He asked about Kevin's financial situation, his employment history, his relationships. My father admitted Kevin had always been financially unstable, bouncing between jobs, accumulating debt. He'd asked our parents for loans multiple times over the years, which they'd given him. Loans he'd never repaid. That evening, Detective Ashford called with an update. "We executed a search warrant at Kevin's apartment. He wasn't there, but we found extensive evidence. He had a file on his computer with templates for medical updates, a folder of photos purchased from a stock photography site showing hospital patients, and detailed financial records showing where the money went." I asked, "Where did it go?" Ashford said, Gambling, online sports betting, poker sites, casino transactions. He burned through approximately $75,000 in 6 months between what he collected from the GoFundMe, your parents' direct transfers, and additional donations he solicited privately. He's in deep with a bookie named Ray Carpenter, who operates out of an illegal gambling operation downtown. Carpenter's people were putting pressure on Kevin for repayment, which is likely why the scheme became so aggressive. My father was listening on speakerphone. He said, "So he invented a dying son to pay his gambling debts?" Ashford's voice was flat. "Yes, sir. That's exactly what he did." The next morning, I woke to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Someone had discovered the GoFundMe was fraudulent and posted about it on social media. My phone was flooded with messages from donors demanding explanations, from friends asking if it was true I wasn't sick, from extended family members expressing shock and betrayal. I called Detective Ashford immediately. He said, "GoFundMe froze the account and is issuing refunds to all donors. They're cooperating fully with the investigation, but news of the fraud has spread quickly." He paused. "Mr. Reeves, you should prepare for media attention. A local reporter has already contacted our department asking about the case. A feel-good cancer fundraiser turning out to be elaborate. Fraud is newsworthy." I felt my stomach drop. I'd gone from privately healthy to publicly terminal to publicly the victim of fraud in less than 24 hours. By afternoon, my phone became unusable. News outlets were calling, reporters were showing up at my apartment building, and the story had been picked up by local television stations. I watched myself discussed on the evening news, my GoFundMe photo displayed alongside my actual professional headshot from LinkedIn. The contrast was stark. The anchor described the case as a shocking betrayal that exploited the compassion of an entire community. They interviewed donors who felt violated and angry. My church pastor appeared on camera expressing devastation that someone would fake cancer to steal from his congregation. The segment ended with Detective Ashford confirming an active manhunt for Kevin, who remained missing. I turned off the television and sat in the dark, feeling like my identity had been stolen twice, first by Kevin's fraud and now by public spectacle. My parents stayed with me that night, none of us able to be alone with our thoughts. My mother kept apologizing, saying she should have demanded to visit me in person, should have insisted on talking to my doctors directly, should have questioned why Kevin was the only point of contact. I told her Kevin had exploited her trust and her fear, that it wasn't her fault. My father sat rigid and silent, his jaw clenched. Finally, he spoke. "I gave that boy every advantage. Paid for his college, helped him get jobs, bailed him out of debt 3 times. He thanked me by using his brother's fake cancer to fund his gambling addiction." The word boy was heavy with contempt. Kevin was 32 years old, 3 years younger than me, but in that moment, he'd become something less than a man in our father's eyes. On day 3, Detective Ashford called with news. "We've located Kevin. He's at a motel outside the city using a credit card in his girlfriend's name. We're moving to arrest him now. Given the media attention, he knows we're looking for him, but apparently decided against running." Within 2 hours, I received confirmation. Kevin was in custody, arrested without incident, and being transported to county jail for booking. He'd be arraigned in the morning. Ashford said, "The district attorney is treating this as a priority prosecution, given the amount stolen and the nature of the deception. You and your parents should plan to attend the arraignment." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Kevin sitting in a cell, probably crafting excuses and justifications, preparing to minimize what he'd done. Part of me wanted to confront him, to make him look at me and acknowledge my health, my reality, my humanity that he'd erased for his convenience. The courthouse was packed with media when we arrived for the arraignment. Cameras tracked our entrance as Detective Ashford escorted us through a side door to avoid the crowd. Inside the courtroom, we sat in the front row as Kevin was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed. He looked thinner, disheveled, and when his eyes found mine, he looked away immediately. The judge, a stern woman named Eleanor Rossi, reviewed the charges: wire fraud, identity theft, theft by deception, forgery, fraudulent solicitation of donations. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Daniel Cross, argued Kevin was a flight risk given the severity of charges and his knowledge of the investigation before arrest. Kevin's public defender, A young woman who looked overwhelmed requested bail be set, arguing Kevin had cooperated with arrest and had community ties. Judge Rossi's expression was cold. She said, "Mr. Reeves exploited his own family's love and an entire community's compassion by fabricating a terminal illness for financial gain. Bail is denied." Kevin's shoulders sagged as he was led away. Prosecutor Cross met with us after the hearing in a small conference room. He laid out the case against Kevin. "The evidence is overwhelming. We have the computer files showing premeditation, the financial records tracking the money, testimony from the bookie confirming the gambling debts, and 230 victims who donated under false pretenses. We're offering a plea deal. 15 years with possibility of parole after 10 in exchange for full restitution and a detailed confession." My father's face was stone. He said, "What if he doesn't take the deal?" Cross said, "Then we go to trial and he's facing up to 30 years on combined charges. But trials mean you'll all have to testify publicly, and the media circus will continue for months." My mother looked at me. "Liam, what do you think?" I thought about standing in a courtroom while Kevin's lawyer tried to make excuses for what he'd done, while donors recounted their pain, while our family's betrayal became public entertainment. I said, "I want him to admit what he did. Publicly. If he does, that, I can accept the plea." Kevin's attorney contacted Cross 3 days later. Kevin would accept the plea deal with one condition. He wanted to meet with me privately before allocating at sentencing. Cross called to relay the request. "He says he wants to explain himself to you directly. You're under no obligation to agree, but his attorney thinks it might provide closure." I surprised myself by saying yes. I wanted to hear Kevin try to justify what he'd done. I wanted him to face the person whose identity he'd stolen. The meeting was arranged at the county jail in a secure room, monitored by cameras. Detective Ashford accompanied me, standing outside the reinforced glass door. Kevin was brought in wearing jail scrubs, his hands cuffed to a chain around his waist. We sat across from each other at a metal table bolted to the floor. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Kevin said, "You look good, healthy." The absurdity of the statement almost made me laugh. I said, "That's because I've never been sick. I've never had cancer. I've never been in treatment. Everything you told Mom and Dad was a lie." Kevin nodded slowly. "I know. I'm sorry." The words felt empty. I leaned forward. "You put them through hell. They thought they were watching their son die. They sent you their savings believing they were helping me survive cancer. And the whole time, you were gambling it away. Mom cried herself to sleep for 6 months thinking I was suffering alone. Dad aged 10 years in half that time. How do you say sorry for that?" Kevin's face crumpled. I was desperate. The people I owed money to were threatening me. I needed a lot of cash fast, and I knew Mom and Dad would help if they thought it was for you. It was supposed to be temporary. I thought I'd win enough to pay them back, and no one would ever know. I stared at him. "You thought you'd gamble your way out of gambling debt using money stolen through faking your brother's terminal illness? Do you hear how insane that sounds?" Kevin's hands were shaking. "It spiraled. Once I started the GoFundMe and the church got involved, I couldn't stop. People kept donating and asking for updates, so I had to keep creating medical details and timelines. I bought the photos online, wrote the updates using medical information I researched. It became this elaborate story I had to maintain." I felt cold rage building. I said, "You researched lymphoma symptoms to make my fake cancer more believable. You described side effects I never experienced, fears I never felt, gratitude I never expressed. You wrote in my voice, Kevin. You stole my identity and my illness to make money." He looked down at his cuffed hands. "I know it was wrong. I know I can't fix it. But I need you to know I never meant to hurt you specifically. You weren't the target." I stood up, the chair scraping loudly. "I was absolutely the target. You used my name, my face, my reputation, my relationships. You made everyone who cares about me suffer. Don't insult me by saying this wasn't personal." I left the room without looking back. Detective Ashford followed me to the parking lot where I sat in my car, shaking with adrenaline. He said, "For what it's worth, that took courage. Most victims wouldn't confront their abuser face to face." I realized that's what Kevin was. Not just a fraudster or a thief, but someone who'd abused the familial bond, weaponized our parents' love, and violated my identity for his own gain. The sentencing hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later. The courtroom was again packed, this time with donors, community members, and media. Kevin stood before Judge Rossi to formally accept his plea and be sentenced. She asked if anyone wanted to give victim impact statements. I stood first. My voice was steady as I faced the judge, not Kevin. Your Honor, Kevin didn't just steal money. He stole 6 months of my parents' peace and my own reputation. He made everyone who cares about me mourn for a disease I don't have. He turned my identity into a commodity and my relationships into profit centers. My mother spoke next, her voice breaking. I prayed every night for my son to survive cancer that didn't exist. I felt guilty for every moment of joy because I thought my child was suffering. Kevin watched me cry and sent me fake updates that made me cry harder. He's my son too, and I don't know if I can ever forgive him for what he did to his brother and to us. My father's statement was brief and devastating. Kevin is dead to me. The son I raised wouldn't have done this. Whoever this person is can serve his time and never contact this family again. The pain in the courtroom was palpable. Judge Rossi then asked Kevin if he wanted to make a statement. He stood, his voice barely audible. I destroyed my family for gambling debts. I lied to everyone who trusted me. I made my brother's fake terminal illness a source of income. I deserve everything this court gives me. Judge Rossi's expression was hard. She sentenced him to 15 years in state prison, as agreed in the plea, with mandatory restitution of $77,000 to be paid to victims according to a schedule determined by the probation department. As Kevin was led away, he glanced back at our family one final time. There was no defiance in his expression, only exhaustion and shame. Outside the courthouse, Prosecutor Cross told us, GoFundMe has refunded every donor, so your parents and others won't lose their money. The platform is also improving their verification processes for medical fundraisers because of this case. My father said, what about the gambling operation Kevin was involved with? Cross said, Detective Ashford's working with Vice to build a case against Ray Carpenter and his operation. Your brother's testimony will be part of that investigation. So Kevin's fraud would have consequences that extended beyond our family, potentially dismantling an illegal gambling ring that had enabled countless other desperate people to destroy their lives chasing impossible wins. The media attention gradually faded over the following weeks, replaced by newer scandals and tragedies. But our family's internal damage was permanent. My parents struggled with guilt despite my repeated assurances that Kevin had manipulated them expertly. My mother started seeing a therapist to process what she called phantom grief, the mourning she'd done for my fake illness that had nowhere to go now that the illness was exposed as fiction. My father threw himself into advocacy work, speaking to church groups about fraud prevention and the warning signs of exploitation. I returned to my work at Grayson Engineering, where my coworkers treated me with careful kindness, unsure how to address what had happened. My boss called me into his office and said, "Take whatever time you need. Your well-being matters more than project deadlines." I appreciated the sentiment, but found work was actually a relief, a space where I could focus on concrete problems with engineering solutions instead of the emotional wreckage Kevin had created. 3 months after sentencing, I received a letter from Kevin's prison counselor. He was requesting permission to write to me as part of his rehabilitation program. The counselor's note explained Kevin was in intensive therapy addressing his gambling addiction and the underlying behavioral patterns that led to the fraud. I stared at the letter for days before responding. I wrote back declining ongoing contact, but agreeing to receive one letter if Kevin wanted to communicate. A week later, his letter arrived. 4 pages of small, dense handwriting that detailed his spiral into gambling addiction, the mounting debts, the fear of the people he owed money to, and the moment he conceived the cancer fraud scheme. He described researching lymphoma, buying stock photos, creating the fake timeline. He wrote about the guilt that ate at him with each update he posted, each donation he received, each time our parents called asking about my condition. He wrote that he'd convinced himself he'd pay everyone back before they found out, that he'd win big and fix everything, but the gambling had consumed every dollar. He ended by saying he understood if I never forgave him, that he didn't deserve forgiveness. but he wanted me to know the truth of how completely he'd destroyed his own life along with everyone else's. I read the letter once and filed it away. Months passed. My parents slowly began rebuilding their lives, though my mother still occasionally slipped and asked how I was feeling before catching herself and looking devastated. The church community that had donated to the fake GoFundMe invited me to speak at a service about fraud awareness. I accepted, standing before the same congregation that had prayed for my non-existent recovery. I thanked them for their compassion and explained how that compassion had been weaponized by someone they trusted. I emphasized that their impulse to help had been beautiful and right, that Kevin's exploitation of it didn't diminish their generosity. The standing ovation I received felt both healing and uncomfortable, praise for surviving something I'd never actually experienced. 1 year after Kevin's sentencing, my parents received their first restitution payment from his prison work earnings, $75. At that rate, full restitution would take decades. My father didn't deposit the check. He framed it and hung it in his office with a plaque that read, "The price of betrayal." It was his way of processing what Kevin had done, turning the theft into a tangible reminder of trust broken and family fractured. I eventually met someone, a woman named Rachel, who worked in medical research. When I told her about Kevin and the fake cancer, she listened without judgment and said, "Your brother didn't just steal money. He stole your medical narrative. In my field, we'd call that identity trauma." Her clinical framing helped me understand why the violation felt so complete. Kevin hadn't just used my name, he'd created an entire alternate version of me, sick and suffering and grateful, and distributed that false identity to everyone who knew the real me. 2 years after the trial, my father had a heart attack. Not fatal, but serious enough to require surgery and lifestyle changes. As I sat in the actual hospital waiting room during his procedure, my mother turned to me and said, "Kevin stole the practice run. When we thought you were sick, we learned how to sit in hospitals and wait and pray. But it was all fake, so when your father actually needed us, it felt like we were doing it for the first time." I understood what she meant. Kevin had staged a dress rehearsal for family medical crisis, complete with emotional drainage and financial strain, leaving us depleted when real illness arrived. My father recovered, and during his recuperation, he made a decision. He removed Kevin from his will entirely and established a fund to support legitimate cancer research and patient assistance programs. Since people donated thinking they were helping cancer treatment, the money should eventually go to actual cancer treatment, he explained. It was his way of transforming Kevin's fraud into something meaningful, redirecting the community's compassion toward people who genuinely needed it. 3 years after Kevin's incarceration, he became eligible for parole review. The review board invited victim statements. I submitted a letter explaining that while Kevin had expressed remorse, the damage he'd caused was permanent and irreparable. I didn't request he serve his full sentence, but I made clear that his release would not include reconciliation with our family. The parole board denied his first request. 4 years in, I received unexpected news. The district attorney's office called to inform me that Kevin's testimony had been instrumental in dismantling Ray Carpenter's illegal gambling operation. Carpenter and 4 associates were convicted on racketeering charges. Prosecutor Cross, who'd handled Kevin's case, said, "Your brother's cooperation doesn't excuse what he did, but it prevented other people from being victimized by that operation. Thought you should know." I didn't know what to do with that information. Kevin had caused tremendous harm, but his testimony had apparently prevented additional harm to others. Did that matter? Should it change how I felt about him? I discussed it with Rachel, now my fiancée. She said, "Good actions don't erase bad actions. They just exist simultaneously. Kevin can be both the person who defrauded your family and the person who helped prosecute criminals. Those things don't cancel each other out." Her clarity helped me let go of needing Kevin to be entirely villain or victim. He was simply someone who'd made catastrophic choices and was living with their consequences. 5 years after the sentencing, I married Rachel in a small ceremony with my parents, close friends, and carefully selected family members. Kevin's name was never mentioned, but his absence was palpable. My father walked me down the aisle without his younger son present, and my mother cried through the ceremony with grief that was only partially about joy. We'd become a family defined by who was missing as much as who remained. 7 years after Kevin's conviction, I became a father. My son was born healthy, and when I held him in the hospital, I thought about Kevin's fake medical narrative and how completely different this real medical experience felt. The exhaustion, the fear, the overwhelming love, all authentic and mine. I sent my parents a photo from the hospital, and my mother's response was immediate. Our first grandchild, born healthy into a family that will protect him from people who exploit trust. Her phrasing was deliberate. She'd spent 7 years processing Kevin's betrayal, and it had fundamentally changed how she viewed family loyalty and vulnerability. My father's message was shorter. Teach him that character matters more than blood. I understood they'd written off Kevin completely, that whatever relationship had existed was permanently severed. 8 years in, Kevin became eligible for parole again. This time, I didn't submit a statement. I'd said everything that needed saying years ago. The parole board granted his release to a halfway house with strict conditions, mandatory continued therapy, and a restitution payment schedule that would extend into his 60s. I received notification of his release, but felt nothing. He'd become a stranger whose actions once intersected painfully with my life, but who no longer held any emotional territory in my present. 9 years after that day, I discovered the first mysterious transfer in my banking app. I was living a full life that Kevin's fraud had tried to steal, but ultimately couldn't. I had my wife, my son, my career, and my parents, though they were older now and scarred by their younger son's betrayal. My father's heart condition was managed, my mother's phantom grief had evolved into cautious resilience, and I'd learned that identity theft isn't just financial, it's existential. Kevin had created a version of me dying of cancer and made it temporarily more visible than the healthy reality. But reality had won, as it always does eventually. The truth was stronger than the lie, though the lie left permanent marks. I never saw Kevin again after his release from prison, and that was exactly as it should have been. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.